Good morning, Mr. Richards. This morning we start with our first witness, who wishes to be known as Nigel, does he?
Sir, that's right, Nigel Hamilton.
Please state your full name.
Nigel Peter Hamilton.
And take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Nigel, you have a twin brother, Simon, who we heard from yesterday.
Yes.
And you too were diagnosed with haemophilia as a child.
Correct.
And you have haemophilia A.
Yes.
And until, I think, relatively recently, you've understood your haemophilia to be classified as mild.
Yes, that's correct.
But you now understand it may be more correctly classified as moderate in terms of its severity.
Yes, I can explain that. I referenced it in my medical records. That in itself, getting those records was a bit of a battle. But with the support of both my big twin brother and my solicitor's firm, we were able to have a meeting with the Trust, and documents which had initially been disposed of reappeared. And in those documents, it identified in one of the correspondence that we were deemed to be mild, in that we were assessed to be mild when they checked our bloods, but in response to various bleeding episodes, they identified that there was something that it suggested that wasn't right, and we were more moderate. So that situation was in the correspondence, something that we were not aware of, and the fact that the chief virologist had been asked to undertake a study of the wider family group, which also indicated those symptoms, suggested that we were moderate rather than mild.
Now, as a young child, you had the kind of minor bumps and bashes and minor problems and that one might associate with your condition.
Yes.
And you required Factor VIII products from time to time during your childhood.
Yes, we did.
And there was, when you were about 11, I understand, you and indeed your brother had to undergo dental work. You required hospitalisation, and you were given Factor VIII on that occasion as well.
Yeah, for even mild haemophiliacs in those days, it was a scary exercise, both for the medical profession and for ourselves and our parents. It was suggested by School of Dentistry that we would have spacing, so perfectly good teeth had to be removed to allow us to have a better grin. And as a result, we were both of us in hospital together. They decided to do it with the both of us, so we had company to each other. And on that occasion, there was quite a lot of bleeding. I was actually released first, and Simon stayed a little longer than I did because he had more severe bleeding than I had. But clearly we got Factor VIII product to help us through that process.
And then as a child you'd suffered an eye injury, and that led to the development of a squint in one of your eyes.
Yeah, that in itself was quite a turning point for me in my life. It had a number of severe impacts. It kept me back from studying. I had to wear a patch. At one stage, my father had to remonstrate with the specialist because he wanted to remove the eye in fear that it may actually cause severe damage to the other eye in my vision. But with God's good grace, we came through. They retained the eye, and I went through 6 to 7 months of treatment, patching up, and trying to improve the muscular development and redevelopment of the eye itself. It has left me with very sufficient peripheral vision, but it has also left me with issues in relation to a change in colour, mild change in colour. Green is not green necessarily, you know.
And in the course of your teenage years in particular, you became very self-conscious about that. And That culminated in the middle of 1976 with you undergoing some form of eye corrective surgery.
Yes, I remember the process very well. I remember the experience and the lead up to it. Facilitated that for us, in which she was very diligent. We met with my parents and myself met on a family haemophilia day in Craigavon Hospital, and we met with the then Professor Archer, who was dealing with the eye issue for me. In the records, quite clearly, there is correspondence between and Professor Archer identifying that he wanted to ensure that when I did go for the procedure, it would not interfere with the schooling that I was having. So I had the procedure on the 13th of July, 1976. I was 14 years of age.
And if we have up on screen, please, 2340008, we can see the factor products that you were given around the time of that surgery. So we've got the date there of this letter, 6th of August 1976. The first paragraph refers to the surgery which you had, and then we can see in the second paragraph he was given cryobulin cover preoperatively and for 10 days post-operatively, and so on. So you received factor products to accompany that surgery in the way described there.
Yes, the medical experts determined that that was an essential aspect of the procedure, and they wanted, as they always did, diligently to provide sufficient cover that if a bleed did occur, it could be controlled and it wouldn't cause further damage to the actual procedure itself.
Could we just go back up to the top of the that? Yes, thank you very much.
Nigel, bearing in mind you were still a child, albeit in your mid-teens at that stage, were you or your parents, as far as you're aware, ever given any information or warning or advice about any risks of bloodborne viruses associated with the use of factor products?
No, we weren't. Our initial desire, and my parents as my guardians made it clear that it was only to be a procedure if at that stage it would be safe. I was a young teenager. I was at Belfast Inst. We were going out and starting to go out with girls from sister schools, for want of a better phrase. And I didn't want to be the odd boy on the block. I didn't want to be the guy with a squint, cock eye. I wanted to be the guy that was the same as everybody else, just slip into the group. And I felt it essential for me and for my self-well-being that I was given the opportunity to do that. That's why we had the procedure. In relation to the treatment and the pre-meeting, which I vaguely recall, it was made evident that the procedure would be provided and sufficient cover would be given and it wouldn't be a major problem. And therefore, between the two consultants, it was determined the date was set and we took the procedure. And
it's right, I should point out that her witness statement in response has said that such facts as were known about the treatment in 1976 were given, she says, but she says that the use of products at that time was considered to be effective and safe. And obviously, as you know, Nigel, those are issues that the inquiry will be exploring at later stages. So as far as you were concerned, the operation was a success. You got on with your life, you finished your schooling, and you went to university.
That's right, I did.
And then in or around 1984 or 1985, you were invited to attend, along with a number of others, a meeting at the Royal Victoria Hospital. What can you recall about that meeting? Aspects of that meeting are indelibly imprinted on my mind. The issue itself was something that was coming to the fore through the press. It was on TV. It became evident that there was a virus, the source of which they weren't sure, but the impact of which was very serious. And we were, as haemophiliacs in the community of haemophiliacs, with families throughout Northern Ireland, we were asked to attend one of a number of group meetings that were being held. These were in closed forum. I remember very well, we went into the room, which I believe in the statement indicates it was a lecture theatre. I would concur with that. I remember it was a two-doored chamber. There were probably, I would have thought from my recollections, about 40 to 50 people, maybe slightly more.
We were comfortably in the room. Came in with Frank Jones, the then registrar, and Kay Farrell, the then outpatient sister. And she conferred with us on concerns that she had and checks she wanted to make to be sure that we were aware, or she was certainly aware, and the medical staff who looked after us, that if this virus was contaminating any of us, that they would have a record of that. There were several elements of that meeting that I found strange, given the fact that there was a considerable amount of hype as to who may have been sources in the press in relation to the contamination of individuals with the AIDS virus, as it was then known. One of those was that give us the choice, and that's been referenced in previous witness statements and in evidence given in the medical records, that she wanted to know, medical staff would take our bloods and test us, but it was up to us to decide whether we wanted individually or as families to be told. I find that, when left, I find that to be quite a strange exercise in itself. It seemed to me, as a young man starting out in life, and I was in my days in university, I felt such a critical issue would be something that we would definitely individually and as families need to know about. We would need to be aware if we were infected with something that had potentially catastrophic impacts.
And just pausing there, Nigel, is this right? And it's what you suggest in your statement. The reason you thought that it was strange to have the choice left was because of the wider public health implications. If somebody who was, in fact, infected with HIV did not know about that.
If somebody chose not to be told they were a potential time bomb or hand grenade, they could have infected a number of other people. And we have seen situations in previous years, past years, where individuals who have made a decision not to inform potential partners from a social event and intimacy have found themselves, when identified as carrying but not informing, have found themselves under the duress of the legal system. That makes sense to me. It would have made sense to me at the time. Why would I want to walk around infecting people? If I had something, I would want to know.
And so you have a memory of the meeting and physically where it was, and that there were lots of people there, came in and spoke in the way you described. And what, if anything, can you recall of what then happened?
You mean post-meeting?
No. Do you remember anything else about that meeting itself?
Oh, yeah. One other element that I found strange, but that added concern to me, was that decided to retire from the room, as she had stated. She indicated that she wanted us to talk about this as a group of people and share our thoughts and decide, because we were invariably going to be the potential positives or negatives. She retired from the room with Frank Jones and with Kay Farrell, and I remember the two doors being closed. Now, it is in my mind that the doors were locked. And
it's right to say Dr. says in her statement that that's not the case, they were not locked.
In the statement, she doesn't recollect that. In my statement, I do.
Yes.
Now, I could be mistaken, but it has stuck with me. The reason why that was done was to ensure that nobody else came in, because this was quite a sensitive issue, a very sensitive, potentially very sensitive issue, and that in order to allow us to deliberate this matter before she returned, and no one would interfere by coming in and catching maybe someone talking and saying something, or being aware of what that issue may have been, because there was a fairly high degree of secrecy outside the community. It was important that we were given the opportunity to do that in peace without any distractions. She did come back in, and then from my recollections, we were individually taken and blood tested, and then the opportunity had been given to us to come back if we wanted to know, or not come back if we didn't.
And your choice was to be informed?
I thought that was the most responsible thing for me to do as an individual, and as also a member of a wider society.
And your HIV test was negative?
Yes, it was. Bearing in mind, I think that the HIV testing only really was effective from 1984.
Now, you've also explained in your witness statement, and I don't propose to go to the detail of it because it's there in writing, but you've identified a range of other factor products that you understand that you received over the years, in addition to the cryobilin that we've seen from 1976.
Yes, can I say the directorate, which ran as a haemophilia director, sought product within the means of her budget. And there were a number of competing pharmaceutical companies who were very keen to ensure that their product was listed. And as a result, I, along with others, would have tolerated some aspects of the side effects of some of those. So there were side effects in the early days. And it was probably deemed necessary to ensure that there were a variety of products so that they would be more sympathetic to the victim or the individual who was, as a patient, taking those products, and they would have a minimum effect as side effects. That would be my understanding of why.
Now, you began work in 1987,
yes,
or thereabouts,
yeah.
And obviously at this point you understood that you did not have HIV, and you were unaware of any other infection that you might have received.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
You married, you started a family.
Yep.
But you became aware, without realising their significance, of certain physical symptoms over these years. What kind of symptoms were they?
Yeah, I started work with a company that required me to be based in the UK mainland. I went into the sales arm of that company, and needless to say, England is a much bigger place than Northern Ireland, which is probably the size of Yorkshire. So I was given quite a large area to cover, and it became increasingly larger as certain staff were paid off and certain staff were maintained. So I was covering a vast area from Lowestoft and Norfolk up to the Watford Gap, and from the Watford Gap up to Birmingham. So I had a young lady who was my, as an aside, who was my inside sales rep, and she would set my, as they did, set my appointments based on the maps, so we would have 3 or 4 cluster appointments in the same area. Not so easy when industry is spread over a larger area, and I may have had one appointment in Oxford, I may have then gone to Lowestoft, I may have headed up to Cambridge, and then headed home. I was usually setting off about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. The average week for me was about 2,000 miles.
So you were working very hard, and you had a young family, and
yeah.
you were travelling a lot.
Yes.
And you put down the fatigue and the lethargy to those life events.
Yeah, bringing up a young family, at that stage we had 1 and then 2 children. It was difficult for both of us. We had to set our schedule. And my wife looked after the kids when I was working, obviously, and at weekends she expected, quite rightly, as I did, to spend time with her and with the kids. I was climbing literally out of the car seat and onto the sofa. I was butchered. And I thought it was because of the mileage, and I always thought, yeah, okay, but you're holding your job down. Just keep it up. You're not used to big miles. Northern Ireland's not a big place. A large travel in Northern Ireland might be from Belfast to Enniskillen. That would have been half the journey to the first appointment.
And the way you put it in your statement is this: I was aware of becoming more easily fatigued and tired and bound by colds and lethargy. I was, though, working hard and assumed I was getting run down.
Yeah, and I can give you an anecdote on that. There was a chap who was a good runner. I had rode a lot when I was in Northern Ireland before I'd gone to work. And I had been very fit. As a young man, I was very fit. My brother and I were oarsmen. We competed at a fairly high level. I gave that up when I went to work in England, and I wanted to keep myself fit because I was eating chocolates, travelling distances, sitting in a car in traffic jams, etc., and had to have my wits about me. And the natural form of relaxation would have been to run. And I lived in Derbyshire, I lived in a nice area in the Peak District, and I had a neighbour who was a good runner, and he made me compete with him. That stopped after a short time because I just didn't have the energy to even put my shoes on.
Now, there came a point at which you became, or you were violently sick, violently unwell, and that led to you seeing a consultant in Newcastle, and you were given information then about your health.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that meeting?
And just to set the scene, I had progressed from sales rep to a regional manager for the company looking after Scotland, Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland and the northeast of England. And I was travelling a lot. I'd gone to from Newcastle up to the Loch Ryan area where we had an office and we were closing that. And I found myself taking staff out for a meal. And I developed that evening and had to get the hotel doctor to come. A severe sickness of the stomach. I think it was food poisoning. I'll not say which restaurant I was in. But suffices to say, I was violently ill. And I was really quite concerned. It was an experience I'd never had before. And being a haemophiliac, I was quite concerned. Some blood was brought up. I was then travelling over to Northern Ireland and down to the south on business. I found myself quite unwell, lightheaded, in a lot of pain. But I didn't let that stop me. And when I was over, I went to and I called in to say hi, see some of the staff, and just say, look, this is what's happening in my life. And I took the opportunity to say to her, I've had a problem. I was violently ill. Can you check it out? And she did. She had an inspection done for me, an esophageal inspection, and they identified that I had a tear. She gave me the choice of having it resolved there or having it resolved in the UK mainland where I lived, and I elected to do that because that's where my family were. So I cut my journey short and went back, and she had already contacted Dr. Jones, and I went in and there was a bed for me in the Royal Infirmary in Newcastle. Following the procedure to resolve what was a minor tear, but for a haemophiliac, continual seeping bleed, I found myself being called into what was more or less a room cupboard, a small meeting area, which was a part of the original Victorian ward. So I sat down, I wondered what this was about, and this medical doctor came in with a big pile of records and introduced herself. It was a hepatologist in the Freeman Hospital. All news to me. Didn't know where the Freeman Hospital existed, but it became evident that it was quite a serious issue that she wanted to discuss. And she led me through by asking me if I'd heard of hepatitis, and I said I had. Had I heard of hepatitis A and B? And I said yes. And have you heard of non-A, non-B? And I said no. And she said, well, I regret to tell you that you have been infected with hepatitis C. And my first response was, no, I haven't. And she said, yes, you have. And I said, have you evidence? And she said, yes, I have. And I asked her when that had begun. And she produced from this batch of files blood tests. And she was able to show me when I received and from what batch I received and when I was infected. And that was on the 13th of July, 1976, the day I'd had my procedure. I realized then that they were my medical records, and I questioned her on why she had my medical records, and I hadn't seen any of this. And she said that she had sought those from my consultant hematologist, and they were both conferring about my health. At that stage, they were obviously aware that there was an issue that had begun back in 1976, bearing in mind, I believe that was now 1990. So this was news to me, and as you can imagine, the very first experience of hearing this left me in total shock. My first anxiety was to my family. If I've had this for that length of time, and I now have 4 sons and a wife, are they infected as well? And I had to break the news to my wife.
Just sticking for a moment with the consultation with the doctor in Newcastle.
Yeah.
Did you know that your medical records had been shared between Belfast and Newcastle or passed over in that way?
No, I wasn't aware of that. I hadn't been involved in that process.
And the first that you knew that you had hepatitis C was this diagnosis being given to you by the consultant in Newcastle.
Correct.
You think about 1990.
Yes, I believe it was around 1990.
And can you recall whether you were given any further information about the condition or the risk of passing it on or the prognosis or anything like that? Yeah,
I did chat with her about the situation. her reasoning for meeting with me was to recruit me to a study she was carrying out with newly being tested treatments. And I felt it was necessary to sign up to this. I wanted rid of this virus. And she made me aware of some elements of what it would have done if it was allowed to pertain in my system. I then was recruited by her to attend on Mondays over a protracted period of months. And the objective was to take treatment, which I was giving myself. In fact, at that stage, they were giving it. Excuse me. And then to go, while I was working in Morecambe area, to travel into the Freeman Hospital, give my bloods, and they could then assess whether the treatments were having the right impact or whether they weren't.
Now, having been told this, well, you say in your statement, to say I was devastated could not describe my feelings in that instant. And you made contact with and went back to see her again in Northern Ireland. What, if anything, can you recall about that meeting?
Well, I decided it was essential. I could travel back and forward in business, but I took time to go myself. I contacted to say that I was coming over, that I had some questions for her that I needed answers to, and we agreed to have a meeting. I sensed, and I recall sensing when I met with her, we had a cordial meeting at the beginning, but at one stage when I had to repeat my insistence that I wanted to see where exactly and when exactly I was infected, she was reluctant initially, stalling initially, I think is probably fairer, and she produced the files. We had them on top of in the area where we were quite private, and there was a panel like a desk this size, and my records would have probably gone to about there at that stage. They're a lot bigger now, and about that height. And she went through one of the piles, and so she knew where it was and when it was, and she pulled it out, and she said, "There it is." I said, "Thank you. Thank you for showing me." And it corroborated the information that I had already seen when I was in Newcastle.
Could we just have up on screen, please, Paul, a further document? It's in Exhibit 2340013. And if you can go to what's about document 19, please, page 19, please, Paul. No, next one. That's it, thank you. So, Nigel, this is from your records, and you've exhibited this to your statement. It's a letter from... it's written for the purposes of insurance, it would seem. It's dated November the 22nd, 1993. I just wanted to ask you to look at what's said in the second paragraph, where it says he is positive for hepatitis C, which was previously designated non-A, non-B hepatitis. A positive result was found in this centre in 1990 and confirmed in Newcastle in 1991. So that record suggests that the diagnosis was first discovered in Belfast and then confirmed in Newcastle.
I would concur with that.
But you were only told by the consultant in Newcastle.
Correct.
Thank you. Now, in addition to that initial trial of interferon, which you started in the circumstances you've described, you then went on to undertake 4 separate courses of treatment for your hepatitis C.
Yes, I did. I had what I was told was PERN Group 3, which was common to the European location that I was in. And they said it could be specific to certain treatments to resolve the issue. My first experience on the treatment with was, I'd probably say, difficult. I was holding my job down. I had cooperation from my firm to take the Monday morning, but of course I had to make it up before the end of the week. As a manager, you have responsibilities. I didn't want to be looked at as being different than anyone else, and that I could hold my corner up. So the treatment was difficult. I had headaches, flu-like symptoms the whole way through that process, shakes, temperature rises, temperature falls, nausea, and which could be difficult and embarrassing, I also had diarrhea. And not easy when you're travelling distances in a car.
If we look at another document which summarises the various courses of treatment you underwent, Nigel, it's 2340012. If we go to the next page. So if we just have the first paragraph highlighted, please, under the heading Diagnosis. This is a much later document, Nigel, that you've exhibited to your statement, but we can see here, if we pick it up from the end of the first line, interferon monotherapy 1995 with no response. So it looks as though you underwent an initial trial and then a course of treatment in 1995 with the side effects you've described and
yes.
Not successful.
Yeah.
You then, in 1998, underwent dual therapy, interferon plus ribavirin, relapsed post-treatment. And just pausing there, your statement explains one of the many side effects you experienced involved mood swings and personality alterations.
Yes, it certainly did. You're never prepared for this sort of thing when it comes. You're living through the middle of it and you don't necessarily realise it's happening to you, but changes were certainly taking place. Issues that were insignificant became critical. I became opinionated. I became defensive. I became offensive. I felt the need to state my case more rigorously than I should have done on many occasions. It wasn't, while it was a daily occurrence, it wasn't constant. In the first episode, it had very serious detrimental impacts on my career, and I wasn't getting any support to deal with the side effects. I was modestly told about them and told that they were different for everyone. But I went through a process of hell. In the second, I had months of renal problems. I was through 7 or 8 different types of antibiotics to resolve the problems, and they never did. So I lost a lot of time not working during that period. On the third, I took antidepressants because it would make me quite depressed. It would make me, I suppose, feel sorry for myself. And on the final one, I had less issues in relation to my mental state and emotional state. But it completely floored me in relation to white blood cells, energy, sleep. One of the big issues that was becoming evident to me, and it was explained to me that the hormonal management within the liver was not as it should have been with a normal patient. And as my liver continued to deteriorate and degrade, I found myself getting maybe 3-4 hours sleep. I might get to sleep at 5 o'clock in the morning. All of that had a direct impact on my personality, needless to say, on my patience, and on my ability to carry out a normal life.
And having undergone that second course of treatment in 1998, ultimately, without clearing the virus, you relapsed post-treatment. You continued to experience the symptoms of hepatitis C. And then in 2004, you received a letter, which we'll put up on screen. It's 2340010, please. And this is the notification in relation to VCJD. What, if anything, do you recall about receiving this letter and the impact upon you?
Just before that, can I say at this stage, I was living in Northern Ireland after the breakup of my marriage, or the breakdown of my marriage, as a result of the treatments that I was on and the nature of my personality under those treatments, and the concern and anxiety of my wife that while not infected at that stage, her and the children were still vulnerable, living with a virus-carrying individual. So I looked then and found that in this correspondence that VCJD had become an issue. It was shortly after this that I actually became a UK trustee for the Haemophilia Society and sat on a panel with consultants in London, and we were debating an issue and treatments around VCJD and its impacts. So this was just the next nail in the coffin for me.
You've put it this way in your witness statement, Nigel. In 2004, I was advised that I was one of a number of patients who'd received factor VIII treatment from blood donated by people who later developed VCJD and was therefore hit emotionally and psychologically by another hammer blow.
Yeah, very much so, yeah, very much so. And can I say, it may not be referenced later on in your questioning, but I've gone through in excess of 30 OGDs, and every time I had to do an OGD, I had to sign a document to confirm that I was aware that I could very well be carrying VCJD, and that had an impact not only on me, I was unclean, potentially, but I couldn't go in as a normal patient. Those treatments, I had to go in last. The very first time I had one of those treatments, I sat for 4.5 to 5 hours because they wouldn't put me in on the date that the administration had given me, because I was designated as having that and also having the risk of that, and also hepatitis C. So I made the arrangements with the consultant that I wouldn't go in the morning, I would go in last in the afternoon.
And again, you describe it very vividly in your statement, that you'd have staff masked up, medical kit once used, discarded or sent for high-power cleansing. You recognised the need to follow protocol, but it was both soul-destroying and embarrassing to have to sign documents and watch nurses, dentists and other medical staff mask up and kit up to deal with me. And you explained it both humiliated and angered you. It was very obvious that why it was people were taking these.
And can I say, I adopted to the protocols reluctantly, but the best way for me to handle that emotionally and mentally was to say that I don't know what you guys have got, and I used to say this, I don't know what you guys have got, but thank you for protecting me from what you may have.
Now, in 2006, you underwent the third course of treatment, and again, you relapsed post-treatment, so that third course was not successful in clearing the virus. And then in 2007, towards the end of 2007, you had a CT scan which showed cirrhosis. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. That, again, was just another nail in the potential coffin. And we were heading towards closing the lid pretty quickly after that. I found myself having to face the trauma of another very negative issue, something that was having a major and detrimental impact on the condition of my health. And it was very difficult to deal with emotionally. It's probably, for me, as much as hepatitis C was an issue, and haemophilia in one sense as well, where you didn't want to share. I couldn't go into a council chamber and talk to colleagues and say to them before we had the meeting, no, I'm not going to have a glass of wine because I've got cirrhosis. They would automatically assume that I'd drunk myself into that state. Very few people in society are aware of the difficulties created to the liver by toxins. Alcohol isn't the only one. Hepatitis is a major one. And for me to have developed cirrhosis was a major concern. I sat with a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who's an MP at the moment. And we sat in my house with my second wife. And we recounted the issue, and we talked about it. And at that stage, I wasn't sure whether I should stay in politics or whether I should leave. I didn't actually put this in my statement, so maybe you don't want to hear this.
No, that's fine, Nigel.
Okay. And we talked about this, and with his encouragement, I stayed on. My wife was, at that stage, was pretty concerned about the issues. And I think she also developed doubts in her mind as to whether or not there was some other reason. And that marriage broke up. So.
You've explained in your witness statement how following the identification of the cirrhosis in 2007, you experienced a number of physical health complications in addition to the ongoing lethargy and pain and so on. And then in October 2015, you had a bleed from the brain.
Yeah. Some say that you can make connections between the treatments that you have and the development of that experience. I was doing business in the south of Ireland with a company. I had developed a working relationship through one of the government training arms in the south, and also with the equivalent body in Northern Ireland with the company I was working for. We specialised in offshore industry, petrochemical business, and I would have done training and travelled to the United States and further afield. And I was at a meeting with a contract colleague from Canada. Had been taking her around Northern Ireland to see other training companies and introducing her company to them. And I found myself suffering from what felt like the onslaught of the flu. I would move my head, and then it would happen. And I said to her, she was very aware of this. She could see that I wasn't myself, and she could see that I had what appeared to be difficulties driving. And we stopped and had something to eat, and I wasn't feeling great. We came back into a meeting, and I sat with one of my directors, with her, and we were chatting away. And everything seemed okay. And I was sitting back thinking, okay, I've had a decent week. We've got the contract, etc., etc. And then I leant forward, and I looked at my director. And so I looked, and then it happened. And I was feeling very rocky. During this period, I was experiencing minor nosebleeds, which became prevalent. And I didn't think that I had ever had a nose issue or a bleeding issue before. Maybe it was blood pressure. I don't know. That's what I thought. I was in Cork, and it happened, and I went straight up to Gary Benson, the consultant hematologist, and I said, look, you've got to do something about this. It needs cauterized. I can't have this happening in meetings or in planes or anywhere else. And he took me in. I made my way back home, and as I was coming home, I was told, one of the sisters phoned me and said, what are you doing? Where are you? And I said, well, I'm driving home. And she said, no, you're not. Turn the car around and come back straight away. The reasoning was that there was more than just a nosebleed. They had done an initial scan, and they've identified that there was an aneurysm, and also there had been what they suspected was a tumour bleed, and there was. And
you were, as you've said, you prevented from working again as a result. You were restricted to bed and home for a period of some 4 months, and you experienced a range of side effects. And then your health problems continued. You began to become bloated and generally feeling very ill indeed.
I had a protracted, long-term chronic issue with my liver, which at the stage I was aware of. It was something that I had, over the years, had to accommodate and come to terms with. And I found myself, really as a result of the shock I felt of this experience with the tumour and the aneurysm, I think that almost triggered the virtual total debilitation of my liver. And I went into a state of serious ill health. I went from wearing suits like this, in fact this was one of them, to not being able to wear suits and going into work in tracksuit trousers and a fleece. And my employer, who was very cooperative and very supportive, took me to the side, and we sat in the boardroom with himself and this other director who I referenced in the Canadian visitors trip. And they were very concerned about my health, and they were afraid that they were pushing me to such an extent that I could die, and they didn't want to be responsible for that. And they said, look, your job's safe. Bear in mind, I'd lost my family. I'd lost my self-respect. I had regained it. False summit upon false summit. And then I got the kick again. Just when I thought everything was okay, it was far from okay. And they said to me, look, take time off, your job is safe. As he and I still joke when we're out playing golf, it was the longest sabbatical he's ever awarded anyone. Such a sabbatical that I never went back to work. My job that I had developed within the company was gone. And now we're just social but very good friends.
Now, by this time, or around this time in 2015, 2016, you'd undergone the 4th course of treatment with triple therapy, a combination of 3 drugs over a 24-week period. Yeah. And that did have a different outcome in terms of the hepatitis C itself.
One of the positive elements of taking treatments that didn't work into the long term rested, as I was described to me by a hepatologist, it rested your liver. Your liver wasn't being bombarded and criminalised, damaged. So during the period, the damage would stop or slow down, and you were giving more longevity to your liver. And then, when the treatments had failed or been unsuccessful, the bombardment started again. So it was respite for the liver, as he described it. The final treatment that they gave me came a number of years after I wanted to continue to try and resolve it, because I was conscious of the fact that, yeah, my health was getting worse, and I didn't want to go to that final precipice of total liver failure. But the treatment came. It was a practical treatment from their perspective and worth applying funding for me, because it would work. They felt pretty successfully on the parent group 3A that I had. So we started that treatment. I can only liken it to something like an extreme form of chemotherapy. Yeah, there was a degree of hair loss. The only place I can grow hair now is just in the lower part of my lip. I went through a lot of nausea. I didn't sleep. 6 months I never slept. Never slept. I lay on the sofa. In fact, I invested in a large TV because I said I'm going to be here for a while. I wasn't allowed to drive. I wasn't allowed to drive because I wasn't fit to get up and get into the car. My judgment was bad on that treatment. My license was ceased for a period of weeks. I had to fight with Gary Benson and my local doctor afterwards to get it back. But it worked. It was worth the sacrifice. The importance of that issue was my hepatologist had advised me that they were unwilling to proceed while I was on the list for transplant, and I had maybe a 20% active liver, but heading downwards at some speed. They said to me that the opportunity to get the transplant rested, really, because the cost of a transplant and the likelihood of getting an accurate liver at the time was always slim. So I took the course of treatment, and while it had during the life of it, devastating impacts, and froze me into a stupefaction of a couch potato. I found myself recovering, and they then could look seriously at giving me a liver transplant.
And in 2016, you were on the liver transplant list. You underwent a variety of tests over a prolonged period of months in that regard, but you didn't, at that stage, receive a transplant. But then at the end of 2017, you were told you had liver cancer in the right lobe.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience in itself. Emotionally for me, it was very interesting. I always felt when I'd heard someone had cancer, oh my God, oh, God help you. God help that poor person. I was actually quite elated. And the reason why, and that may sound very strange, it was a means to an end, a necessary evil. While I was on the transplant list and told that I was moving up, the treatment froze me, and I found myself then starting to get back into the potential to work, and my boss said, look, I've got some work for you out in Antwerp, and I need a guy who's going to go in there and do the business. And I said, well, it gives me a chance to test myself, to see if I've still got the sharpness that I had once had, and to see if I was up to the job. Could I stay, if I got back into employment, at that level? And could I bring back some self-respect and some self-confidence that obviously I had lost? So I took on the challenge, and we were having our Christmas do in Edinburgh. And on the day of the Christmas do, I had to go and see my consultant hepatologist to get the results of a scan test that had been run, one of a number. They thought I had cancer before, with shadows on the liver. It was a monthly occurrence. You took these things. I had 35, I think, OGDs. I got to a stage where I stopped taking the sedative because I needed to drive. So they ran them down, they pulled them out, and I got up, had a cup of tea and went home, or went to work, or did what I had to do. And I found myself then with that issue, having to tell my colleagues who had waited for me to come and join them straight from the airport that I had good news and bad news. They wanted the good news, and I said, we're all going to have a cracking Christmas. And they said, okay, what's the bad news? And I said, I've got liver cancer. One man was sitting opposite eating, because it was a bijou restaurant, a nice Thai restaurant. And it's like something out of one of those comedy scenes. The fork sort of fell as his food came out of his mouth. And he looked me straight in the eye and thought, how dare you come into this restaurant and tell us a story like that? But my colleagues were personal friends, and they wanted to hear the truth, and I had nothing to hide.
On the 12th of February 2018, you received an important telephone call to tell you that there was a donor liver available for you. Yeah,
at this stage I had developed a stable relationship, at last, thank God, with a very good woman. And ironically, her brother also had a transplant, and she lived in the south of Ireland. And she and I were going to take some time and go down over the February the 14th period down to a place called Clifton in the south of Ireland, and have some time to ourselves. I was sitting with my dog beside me, my lifelong partner, and my cat on the sofa, draped over it, and I got a phone call, 1:30 in the morning, and having previously been in politics, when you get a private phone call at that time in the morning, it's either the police or it's the hospital. So I answered, and it was a lady from King's College who said to me that they had a liver. And I said, that's fantastic. I didn't assume that it was for me, because I'd been told on several occasions by my consultant hepatologist that because I'd had 2 treatments to resolve or contain the cancer in my right lobe of my liver, that I would not find myself in a situation where transplant would be practical for another 3 to 4 months. So I had put that out of my head. And I said, when do you need me to come over? Sometime this week? And they said, she said to me, no. She said, you'll be getting a phone call from the air ambulance, which came during the conversation. I said, yes, I'm getting a call now. That's X from the air ambulance. He will phone you back. You need to be over here for your procedure early in the morning. Have you got your bag packed? And I said, I've packed the bag. It's in the car. I have one in the house. Yep, I'm ready to go. And she said, right. Knocked my neighbour up, told him to look after my dog and feed my cat. And he was very generous and said he would. And I headed with a very good friend and met my brother, Simon, at the air ambulance. We got a quality picture, courtesy of the pilot, just in case I wasn't coming home. You have a 20% chance of not surviving a transplant. And you really only get a transplant if you are less than 20% of actually staying alive. So you were caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. And I found myself a willing accomplice in the process. It was an opportunity to try and restore some sense of normality to my life and give me a fresh start. And I was very grateful that after 19 months, this had finally come. And only through the courtesy of liver cancer. So I went across after a 9-hour procedure. I came out of it in the intensive care unit, which looked like something out of a space movie. Fantastic technology that they have developed. And I'm here today to tell a story. And I didn't think I would be. I thought I would lose the opportunity to see the end and get some conclusion to the experiences of the life path that I've had to have, courtesy of the virus.
And you've said this in your statement, Nigel, that after undergoing the transplant and the recovery from it, you returned home to begin the rest of your life. I
did, yeah. And I've pursued that diligently ever since, respecting the quality of life that I have, respecting the sacrifice that was made by the person who gave me that liver, and trying to help other people.
Nigel, you've touched on already, and you've set out in some detail in your witness statement, some of the many broader impacts that your infection and treatments had on your life.
Yeah.
It caused the breakdown of your first marriage, and you've told us today about your second marriage.
Yeah.
It impacted upon the time that you were able to spend with your children growing up.
Yeah.
And it impacted upon your work and employment and career over a number of years.
Certainly did.
Rebuilding a new job and finding a new role in politics in the way you've described in your statement.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there, in terms of the broader impacts, anything that you'd like to add to what you've already told us and what you've set out in the statement?
I have several observations that I would like to make, if that's okay with you, Sir. Thank you. And I've written them down because I've been advised I do go on a bit, as you're probably aware. But I want to be as succinct as possible, and I want to get the points across, and they're important points for me, given the path that I've had and the experience that I've received. So first of all, Sir Brian, I'd like to thank you for taking the opportunity to treat us equally in Northern Ireland and bring here to us the inquiry. It's a case of Rome not going to Caesar, Caesar coming to Rome, and Rome's very grateful. In my case, yeah, you've referenced it, Jenny. I lost my family, I lost my career, I lost my health, and I lost my self-respect. In the early years, or early days, I should say, I saw no hope and no prospect, as the sense of normality wasn't within my grasp. Upon reflection, I questioned my mortality and recognized it was not within my control. And then the new liver, and with it came hope and expectation. It was a real reprieve, a new life and a future. And while I believe I will never get justice, how can you bring back that which has been ripped from my life? I will, through you, sir, and your good judgment, I will get closure. And to my fellow witnesses, who we've heard so far this week and we will hear tomorrow and this afternoon, I'd like to pay tribute for the sharing of their harrowing and emotional experiences. And they've done this in open forum, as have I, to provide an insight into what this national disaster has done to the lives of its victims and the affected and infected community, and the legacy of trauma and pain it has left all of us to cope with. So for me, its legacy can best be summed up by, firstly, in my case, and I know in the case of many, a legacy of institutional medical dependency, the paths of lives like mine irreversibly altered and influenced by infections introduced and outside our control and influence, and in so many cases, the apparent unwillingness to share information until years after the damage had begun to its assault on its victims. I call it the mantra of the mushroom. Kept in the dark and only fed with information when absolutely necessary. And secondly, and just as damning, the legacy and hierarchy of victimhood, and shamefully a government willing to allow financial support of those very victims, people like me, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters, equally infected across the regions, equally affected across the regions, but unequally supported. If I lived in England, the recognition of my victimhood would be different. But in Northern Ireland, like those in Scotland and Wales, all victims of this same National Health Service disaster appear not worthy of equal financial support during the lifetime of this inquiry. That's a sad reflection on a government which has now created a hierarchy of victims under the pretense of it being a devolved matter. That, to me, as an act, is reprehensible. If I lived 50 miles down the road in the south of Ireland, the treatment and respect and recognition would be different again. So while we still have the inquiry here, sir, I believe we must press home our case. We are the same as every other victim in every region of the United Kingdom. I am very pleased that our infected and affected community in England have received further recognition, and that the uplift they have received will ease some of the hardship they, like us, experience. And lastly, while I recognise that the forensic elements and aspects of the inquiry will take place in the new year, I, for the life of me, can't understand why a government seems, to me, to allow itself to be scapegoated for the sole responsibility of this disaster, when I believe the corporate pharmaceuticals have a key role in this tragedy and are themselves, to a degree, complicit. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Sir Brian, before... I'm sorry. That's certainly not quite finished yet. Sir, before I ask Mr Williams if there's anything further to add, I've been asked by Mr Robinson, who represents the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust, to clarify that the witness statement says in relation to the meeting in the 1980s to discuss HIV, that she says, I certainly remember that the room was not locked. I make that clarification.
Well, I thought you made that clear during the course
I thought I had, sir, but I've been asked to repeat it.
There's a difference of recollection between Nigel and on that.
Precisely so, sir. I'm just going to ask Mr Williams, who, as you know, Nigel represents you, if there's anything further. No.
Thank you very much.
If I could just clarify the point on why I raised it. I'm sorry to...
Well, just a moment.
Yes.
We have a process for raising points. What we shall do for a moment is we'll just take a short break so you can go into the witness room here.
Yes, sir.
Mr Robinson can explore with counsel to the inquiry what points he might wish to raise.
Yes, sir.
And we'll take it from there. It may mean that you'll come back in a moment or two. I have a question of my own to ask you in any event, so you can wait for that.
Thank you, sir.
So nothing further that I'm going to ask. Obviously, so you indicated you had a question for the witness. So
Yes, well, we'll bring Mr Hamilton back. Sorry, Nigel back. I'm sorry for keeping you, Nigel. The one thing I wanted to ask was this. Going back to the meeting which was held between two others, and a number of those who had haemophilia and had factor product in 1984-85, thereabouts, as you remember it, in the hospital.
Yes, sir.
She left you there to discuss and consider what you wanted to do.
Yes.
You've told us how you felt strongly, at least you feel strongly now, that you should not have been given that choice because you would be, as you described, a ticking time bomb.
Correct.
And you must have felt that at the time because you said you took the decision to be told because you thought that was the responsible thing to do.
My attitude hasn't wavered over the years.
And you've indicated you thought it was the wrong choice to have left with you. It should not have been offered.
In my circumstances, if I had elected not to be told...
I'm not really so much concerned with your view.
Sorry, sir.
As this. How many of you were there discussing, roughly?
From my recollections, I believe affected and infected family members as well, I believe, in the region of 40 to 50 people. It was a lecture theatre.
Did anyone say, how dare you leave that choice with us, or words to that effect?
I know after the deliberations, when there were views held by both sides quite strongly, whether we were holding those views ill-informed or well-informed at the time, I cannot recall. But the feeling that it was a potential time bomb indicated to me and others that we would need to know. If I had something operating in my system and I wasn't aware of it, I would like to know. If the government put a bug into my head, I'd like to know that bug was there.
Did anyone challenge the doctor about leaving you with the choice?
I do recollect that I made observations to her at the meeting, and I know others did as well. And it became a little bit of a free-for-all. There were people who were totally against it, and others who were totally in favour of it. The reality of it was those personal exchanges would have taken place, I would imagine, after the meeting was over and individuals.
Well, I'm not asking you to imagine.
Yes, sir.
Just to recall, it seems to me, I think, that you probably can't quite remember.
No, sir, I
it
can't.
now.
I can't.
You can.
I can't.
You can't. So if, on reflection, you do recall anything that was said to her to challenge her view and what she may have said in response, could you please put that in writing? It's only fair she should have a chance to consider it herself and comment.
I agree totally.
And let us have that in due course.
I will, sir. I'll give some deliberation to that.
That's all that I wanted to ask. Do any other questions arise
Nothing
out
else,
of that?
no.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed once again, Nigel, for coming, and I'm sorry to have kept you waiting for a few minutes.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll take a break now till 10 to 12.
Thank you, sir.